The following program is brought to you by the Center for Educational Outreach at Baylor College of Medicine.
So there aren't too many people at Rice who do what I do, frankly, because Rice doesn't have a communication department. So there are a couple of us who work in engineering and a couple of us who work in natural science, but we don't have a communication department at Rice. But I have one colleague who teaches a lot of business and marketing presentation skills. And I was watching her coach a team of students one day who were going to present their startup idea for a business to the Rice Alliance, which is a big forum of venture capitalists and angel funding agents. And June said something that really stuck in my head about slide design. And she said, slides should function like billboards. And I thought, she's absolutely right. But instead, we tend to design slides that look more like scripts, right? To cue us through everything we might possibly want to say in our talk. And we copy and paste really dense graphs and tables that were intended for written print material that were not intended for slides, right? Imagine if you were driving down 59 at Buffalo Speedway and you glanced at this billboard and tried to get the key point in an instant, right? You'd crash, right? You'd crash your car in the same way that our colleagues and our students crash when we design slides that look like that. Designing slides that are so cluttered and dense with material places too big a burden on the audience. The cognitive processing load is so great to be listening and watching the speaker and the slide and reading at the same time that people quickly tire out. And when they tire out, they just tune out. That's what happens. So how do we prevent that? Well, I think that this book, Slideology, is a great tool for avoiding that problem. It's a beautiful book about designing slides, and it not only explains the psychology of slide design, but also it involves lots of practice and good examples in the back. This is the best book I've ever seen on slide design. But the author of this book, Melissa Duarte, suggests that you approach slide design as a form of problem solving. And I think that's a great way to view it because slides are not purely decorative or aesthetic. Right? Good slides should illustrate and reinforce and emphasize your key points. That's what good slides do. They're not a crutch. They're not decoration. So in this portion of my talk, my plan is to go over some basic slide design principles that are further elaborated in her book. And I'll be drawing on a lot of examples. So you'll be seeing a lot of example slides, often drafts and revisions in this portion of the talk. And I'm going to focus primarily on arrangement, visual elements, animation, and data. Careful, logical arrangement is what enables your audience to quickly grasp your key point on a slide. And it's a function of several things, but the key features are contrast, hierarchy, and white space. Our brains instantly perceive subtle differences. Right? That's what I mean by contrast. And we try to assign meaning to them. Contrast could be in the form of differences in size, in shape, color, shade, proximity, and you can see in that example that, we have two different shapes, we have two colors, one's thin, one's thick, right? There's lots of evidence of contrast there. But contrast can also go awry. If you, for example, design some slides, and on some of your slides, the bullets, just the circle bullets, are purple, and on some slides they're black, and you just didn't actually notice that when you were formatting the slides, but the audience sees that difference, the purple and the black, they are going to sit there and try to figure out why some bullets are purple and some are black. And it's taking them off message, right? They don't want to be using those extra cycles to figure out black and purple. They need to be using all their cycles to listen to your message. Hierarchy is what enables us to discern relationships in terms of importance or significance, right? And if you think about it, PowerPoint's template is designed on this premise. That's why we have big text at the top, because things at the top are usually more important. Top center is if they're very important, usually, just in general. And then you see that the text gets smaller as you go down, and the subordination is emphasized again by the different bullet style and by the indenting. So there are lots of visual cues here, and the visual hierarchy should reflect the intellectual hierarchy of your argument, right? They should mirror each other. Look what happens if you mess with the PowerPoint template in terms of font size and bolding. Your eyes don't know where to rest, right? You can't tell where to start looking because of the way that I changed the template. Whitespace directs our gaze, right? The white space around those red puzzle pieces makes us focus in on the red, and whitespace creates a visual rest, right? It's a place to rest your eyes. And if you have a slide that has too much stuff on it, you should ask yourself either, what can I cut from this slide that won't change the meaning of my message, or how can I split up all the information on this slide onto separate slides and have it still cohere? Just to give you an example of that, this is his slide to introduce the members of a new technical committee. Ay, 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 right? I mean, there's no margins, no white space around the edge. The equidistant spacing of all these lines makes it hard for your eyes to land anywhere. And you can't actually pick out the names easily in that list. This is not good design. So we worked with it, and we came up with this design. Right, we have it's clear now in terms of hierarchy who the chair is, which was not clear from this slide. We have overlapping ovals, which suggests a team. And it's the same information. It's not like we left things off. This is the same exact words that you have on the previous slide. And you can see how just having white space allows you to focus in on what's important. Here's a grad student's title slide for a conference talk where there are problems with both arrangement, contrast, and hierarchy. Where do your eyes go in that one? Right to the middle. Right? And those things in the middle, nobody knows what those are, so that's not very helpful. Right? And why do your eyes go to the middle? Because of the color, and there's white space around them, and they're in the middle, and they're big. Right? All of those aspects make your eyes go right to the center. And that's not most important. A title slide for a talk should emphasize the title of the talk. Right? People don't walk the halls in a conference and glance in at the title slide and think, huh, cool picture. They might look at the title and think, that's a topic that interests me, and head in. So this is a redesign of that slide. And you can see that it draws your eye up, but the focus is really on the title. In that previous version, it seemed like the title was just floating right up off the top of the slide. So we've talked about arrangement, but what is it that you're arranging? You're arranging visual elements, which amounts to background, color, text, and images. For backgrounds in PowerPoint, you want to choose simple and uncluttered. I know that you can get beautiful templates that might seem relevant to your topic, that are really busy, cool graphics in the background, but wow, it's noise in the background. And when you use those kind of templates, it alters your ability to choose colors that are high contrast for emphasis. So it's better to choose relatively plain backgrounds to maximize the space for the message, because that's what's most important. You should think about a good background color, and the way to determine that is thinking in advance about the ambient light in the room. I personally prefer to present with the lights on because I like to be watching the audience and making adjustments if I see people looking bored or confused. But if you prefer to present in a room that's dark, it's more dramatic. And in that case, you would want to choose a dark background instead of a light background. Colors, you should choose high contrast, and this Slideology has a great chapter on color and some really nice palettes for you to use in slide design. High contrast colors are going to pop on a background, so bright colors generally pop on white or black backgrounds. Choose colors that are culturally appropriate, and I don't just mean in terms of a country's ethnicity. You're nodding your head. Can you give me an example? Okay, did you hear that? Red is not a good color in China,
Japan,
and Japan to use for people's names because it symbolizes death for the name. Otherwise, it's a color of celebration, right? But in that particular connotation, it has a sense of death. I was once watching a group prepare their economics for a proposal, and they used red to highlight what was important in their slides, but then they were using red to highlight in their financials. Right? Bad idea, right? Red financials is usually a bad sign, not a good sign, right? So you want to be thinking about colors being appropriate for the particular venue. Coherence, using the same color over and over for emphasis, can add coherence. And I'm going to show you some examples. These are slides designed by some sophomore bioengineers at Rice who I think did a nice job of using color for coherence. And what I want you to notice is that they've got a legend up here on the top left, and they've used those colors for the different components of their kidney model. And this is the simple model. They brought it up first, and then they exploded it out with the complex model, and notice that the colors are consistent. Imagine how difficult it would be as an audience member if they suddenly switched all the colors because they thought it would look cool to have different colors on the second slide, which I have seen students do. But they nicely use color for coherence here, and then they give an excerpt diagram of a particular feature in the model, and they locate you in the schematic down at the bottom right in terms of where you are in the big model. Just a nice use of color for coherence. A couple of combinations to avoid. Yellow on white is always a bad idea. It usually looks okay on your monitor when you're designing slides at your desk, but once you project it, it's very hard to see. Red on blue, another bad combination. If you stare at red text on a blue background, it actually starts to vibrate. Red on blue. Again, it sometimes looks really attractive on your laptop or your desktop computer, but when you project it, people cannot see it. You should consider that 30% of men are red-green colorblind when you're designing slides. So if you don't want red and green to be your two primary highlighting colors because the effect will be completely lost on potentially 30% of the men in the room. With respect to text slides, first and foremost, the text needs to be legible in terms of the kind of font that you choose. It needs to be large, especially for a large room. Text should be succinct. You want phrases, not full sentences. When you create bulleted lists, you want them to be parallel because that makes it easier for the audience to scan a list quickly. You want to be fairly conservative in your use of text treatments. That's bold, italics, underlining. I actually urge people to avoid underlining altogether because the line usually cuts off the bottoms of the letters, making text less legible. And you want to be consistent in whatever formatting conventions you choose. We recommend a sans serif font for slides and posters. A sans serif font is good for projecting because if you notice, it has a uniform width. The shafts are all the same size. That means that when you're sitting at the very back of a room, you can still see the text, whereas if you have a small serif font where parts of the letters are thick and parts are thin, the thin parts start to disappear at a distance, especially for small text. So serif fonts are good for print documents, right? Times New Roman is an example of that. That's why the newspaper is printed in Times New Roman. But for projecting, Arial, Helvetica, Tahoma, those are better fonts. These are just some general guidelines about font sizes for fairly large venues. If you're presenting to 5 people at a conference table, you don't need to have your slide fonts quite this large. Use informative titles on your slides as much as possible. The real estate on the slide, like I said before, is really precious, right? There's not a lot of room there, especially if you use Whitespace. And so you want to take advantage of that top slot on the slide to convey the key point whenever possible. What's the so what? Answer that question in the title bar of a slide. And here you see I've got 3 iterations of titles, right? The most generic title, an example would be recording industry, looking at the bottom one. Right? This is just a topic, a broad topic. You have no idea what the focus of the slide is. Power in recording industry is a little bit more specific. But if the slide is actually about the 6 main competitors in the industry, then having a title such as Big 6 gain power and profits and evidence on that slide to support that claim is making the most of that title bar slot, as opposed to 6 slides in a row that have recording industry as their title. Or giving a science presentation and you have 6 slides in a row where the title's results, right? Not particularly helpful for an audience. So here's a bad text slide. It's bad for a number of reasons, mainly because there's way too much text. If you put this many words on the slide, what are people going to do? They're going to read it. And if they're reading all the words on the slide, they're not listening to you, or they're really not focused on your message as well. It's helpful to use a hanging indent when you're designing slides. A hanging indent would align all these margins so they're the same so that you don't have different line lengths. You don't want to mix fonts if you can help it. You'll notice this has the serif font and the title is a sans serif font. And again, PowerPoint automatically adjusts the line spacing evenly. That's the default setting. So all these lines are exactly the same distance apart. So the key points aren't chunked visually, spatially, in a way that's helpful. So this was round 2 of that slide, and you can see that some things have changed, but there's still too many words. We've got a widow down here. That's when you have one lone word hanging on a line all by itself. It's not, the list isn't parallel. This is the last version of this slide, and you can see that the list is parallel. We don't have a lot of text. It's just short phrases. There's a different bullet style for the sub-bullet to represent the subordination in the more specific examples. And there was enough room because they cut all the words so that you could put a picture in of what telemedicine is. And as you know, pictures are much more efficient usually for communicating an idea than words. And don't forget that details matter when you're formatting your slides. If you've decided to use, a capitalization for your primary bullet and a lowercase letter for sub-bullets, do that every time. Because if you don't, it represents contrast, remember? And people try to figure out differences. They're wasting their time doing it, but we do it just naturally, instinctively. Make sure that your slides are correct. Reference sources if you've used them. Acknowledge other people if you're using their materials. And don't forget to include your contact information. When you choose images, make sure that they're relevant, high quality, and cropped. Don't choose an image off of a website and then stretch it to where it's all pixelated and useless. Right? I've seen that happen over and over. Go out and search for good images. iStockphoto.com is a good place. It's a great repository for high quality images. It's searchable by keywords.
Is it free?
It's not free, but it's fairly cheap. It's not expensive. iStockphoto.com. It's actually on my slides in the corners because I have acknowledged the images where they came from. You pay depending on the size and resolution of the image you download. I think I maybe sent them $10 and I got 100. I could download 100 images that were good enough for a PowerPoint or a web page. So it's really reasonably priced. And then crop images so that the focal point is on what is most important when you're choosing images. In terms of animation in a presentation, animation should only be used for a purpose, right? It should be used judiciously and for a reason. Animation can be great for showing a process, a sequence. It can be great for emphasis. But it should not be used to introduce every text bullet on every slide. Right? That only slows things down. You might want to keep something hidden and have it appear on a click if you want to keep the audience's attention with you and not have them moving ahead, so to speak. But that should be used only for particular instances and not on every slide. So it should be used with purpose. When you choose an effect, don't choose all the crazy effects, right? You don't want things sort of going like helicopters on your slides or the whole machine gun thing. We don't need any sound effects. Those kinds of things undermine your credibility. Yeah, zooming from different sides of the slide, that makes me crazy. You want to choose the simple effects like appear, for example, or maybe fly in, but fly in slow. And when you have something fly in, you want it to fly in from the closest side of the slide. So, for example, if I want my last point on the slide to fly in, then I don't want it to fly in from the top over all my text, right? I want it to fly in from the bottom, the closest edge. That's what I mean by direction. And then pace. Think about the pace. If you're showing a process, you may want to speed up the animation to make it go more quickly and show it a couple of times for people to see it if it's important. If it's text bullets, it should be slow and there should be a reason for having a text bullet come in on a click. Here's some examples. This is a process, right? This is showing a separation of two different molecules. Here's the use of animation to call people's attention to a feature on a plant. Right? Before I might have been talking about the plant as a whole, and then I want people to look at that one particular position on the plant. So I use animation and a call out to do it. But think carefully about how you use animation. And again, this book has some beautiful examples, and there's a website with this book where you can go and look at all the gorgeous animations that her team has developed. Her team is the team that does the presentations for Apple, okay, and Google. I mean, this is a very slick design firm out in California, so they're beautiful examples online. But some of you mentioned before that you do present data, so I wanted to wrap up the portion of slide design about designing slides that have to do with tables and graphs and figures. First, make them big. If you have a slide with a graph on it, the graph should take up most of the space on that panel. You don't want to have 5 text bullets on half the slide and a puny little graph on the other half. People aren't going to be able to see it. Label things precisely and correctly. Use color for contrast, like we talked about before, and eliminate chart junk. Chart junk is a term that was coined by Edward Tufte. It has to do with all the extraneous information that often appears on people's figures and tables. And you're going to see some examples of that right here. So this was a line graph from a biology talk. And there are lots of problems here. First of all, this was generated by Excel. And Excel automatically creates its own title if you don't uncheck that box when you're designing the graph. So we have the title from PowerPoint, but then we have this other title that we don't really need. Excel also puts this black border around everything that's not necessary. We have 2 legends. They have this one and then the one underneath. This gray background shading, not necessary, and it's actually harder to see the colored lines against gray than it would be against white. These are all the defaults. Grid lines are a default. In this case, we don't need grid lines to make close distinctions between the data points. And there are no error bars in this case, which there ought to be. And the axes labels are really small. I mean, look how small that font is. And there are no units. Remember how I said to label things? Don't forget the units. So this is a redesign of that same graph that's just been cleaned up. Undoing the defaults, thickening the lines a little bit. Notice that the legend information is juxtaposed to the line it represents. It's just much cleaner. Here's a table. This is not helpful. If you look at this, what is the key point of this table? It could be anything. Revenue, not helpful. It's got a general title. There are no visual cues, right? No highlighting, no nothing to tell me what to focus on. The values aren't centered in the cells. Too many grid lines. Here, I use the title bar to communicate the key point, right? The first quarter was the most profitable, and I reinforced that idea by shading that column. So right away, I focused people's attention where I wanted to go. This is the key point right there on top. So let's imagine that I instead wanted you to be able to make relative comparisons of these total revenues by region. Right? To do that, I would create a bar chart with this data right here. So I plugged all that data into PowerPoint's bar chart default, and this is what it generates. Again, this is a lousy bar chart for a lot of reasons. One is it automatically chooses the 3D effect. The 3D effect should only be used for 3D data. It actually distorts people's ability to interpret your data. Because look, is this the line right here, or is this the line right here? It's not as precise. Again, there's this border. The contrast is low contrast. It chooses light blue and gray. Too much space between the bars, right? Because of all this space between the bars, your eyes actually don't know whether to focus on the white areas or the colored areas, because they're the same. And there are too many values on the y-axis, right? We've got them in intervals of 2. We don't need grid lines for this bar chart. Here we go. Same data with a cleaned up bar chart. And you can see that I highlighted the center column, China, because that's where I want people to focus. China generates the highest total revenue for 2008. So this or this. And you'll see on your next slide in the handout, let's say that it's actually not that important for you to be able to make those comparisons by region with the bars. If I just want to convey the key point about China, I might design a slide that looks like this. Right? No data at all. Just the key point. Highest total revenue producer in 2008. So you have to think about your audience and what kind of evidence they value and what kind of evidence informs their decision making and how important it is for them to see the actual data when you're thinking about supporting an argument. Are they going to want to see it for themselves, or is this good enough? So to wrap up this section on slide design, again, think of slide design as a type of problem solving. How can I create slides that really illustrate, reinforce, and emphasize my key points? And how can I arrange the various components so that my message is accessible at a glance, it's comprehensible, and it has impact? Because slides are meant to support the message. They're not a substitute for the message. And if you've been in a position before where you tend to cram a lot of detail onto slides because you want to make sure the audience gets it, and you want to make sure that they walk out of your talk with, you know, the handouts version of your PowerPoint. So you just loaded everything onto the slides for them. It's not a good strategy. Instead, what you need to do is you need to design really good slides based on the principles we just went over and create a separate handout with the details for them to take away. But don't use your slides to serve as a handout at that level of detail, okay? Any questions for me about slide design, about anything that I've talked about?